First story, the Betty Andreasson case, 1967. It was a normal winter evening in January 1967. I remember that night clearly, like it was just yesterday. I was 25 years old, living in Massachusetts with my kids, and it was a typical quiet evening. I was in the kitchen, just finishing up with dinner, and my children were playing in the living room. Then, everything changed. I first noticed the light. It wasn't like a regular street light or headlights from a car. This light was different. It was bright, almost blinding, and it shone through the window, casting a strange glow across the room. At first I thought it was a reflection, maybe from a passing car or some sort of aircraft overhead. But when I looked outside, I saw something I couldn't explain. A large, glowing object was hovering in the sky, suspended with no sound, just drifting silently. It didn't look like any plane or helicopter I had ever seen. I stood frozen, staring at it, and that's when I felt it. Something heavy, a strange pull, as if the ground beneath me was shifting. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It felt like my whole body had turned to stone. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My head felt like it was spinning and my vision blurred. The light grew brighter and brighter, almost overwhelming, until it enveloped me completely. Everything around me, my house, my children, disappeared, and in that instant I was no longer in my kitchen. I had no idea where I was, but I knew it wasn't Earth anymore. When I could finally see clearly again, I found myself in a completely different place. I wasn't in my house, and I wasn't anywhere I recognized. It was like I was floating, or more like I was being pulled through space. I looked around, and there were these beings. I can't explain them well, but they weren't human. They were tall, very tall, maybe 7 feet high. Their skin was gray, almost metallic and smooth, without any visible features like hair or eyebrows. Their heads were large, much bigger than ours, and they had big black eyes that looked like they could see straight into me. They didn't speak in a language I could understand, but I somehow knew what they wanted. It was like their thoughts were entering my mind, not through words, but through a feeling. I wasn't scared, not really, not in the way you would expect. It wasn't like the terror you'd imagine when you think of aliens. These beings weren't threatening. They were calm, almost peaceful, as if they were studying me in a way that didn't mean harm. One of them extended its hand towards me, and it wasn't a gesture of aggression. There was no malice in it. I felt oddly safe, like I was supposed to be there, but at the same time, there was this intense feeling of being out of place, of not belonging. The environment around me was cold, metallic, like I was inside some kind of craft, and it was so sterile. The air had a strange smell, almost like chemicals or something I can't quite identify. It was suffocating in a way, but not painful, just unsettling. And then the fear came, not from the beings, but from the overwhelming sense of isolation. I realized at that moment that I was completely alone. There was no way back, and I had no idea how I'd gotten there. They didn't hurt me, not physically. They didn't touch me in a way that caused pain, but they did things to me. Things I didn't fully understand, things I'm still not sure I ever will. I felt them inside my mind. I could feel their presence, their thoughts pushing against mine. There was no privacy in my own head anymore. I don't know if I was awake or in some sort of trance, but I couldn't escape their influence. One of the beings placed its hand on my forehead, and suddenly I was flooded with images. Flashes of distant worlds, of stars, of places I didn't recognize. It wasn't like a memory. It was like they were showing me things that weren't from this earth. It was overwhelming. I saw images of ships in space, of planets that didn't exist, of skies so vast that it felt like I was floating through eternity. It was like my mind was being expanded in ways I couldn't comprehend. Then, they began their examination. It wasn't painful, but it was uncomfortable. They didn't seem to care about modesty, but I felt strangely calm about it, as if it was happening because it had to. They probed, studied, and it was like they were trying to understand me, understand what made me human. I wasn't scared. At that moment, I don't know why. Maybe it was because the whole situation felt surreal, or maybe it was because they were so calm, so non-threatening. But even then, something deep inside me kept whispering that this wasn't right, that none of this was normal. I felt trapped between two worlds, one that was terrifyingly foreign and another that I could no longer reach. After what felt like hours, or maybe minutes, I'm still not sure, the beings stopped. They didn't say anything, but I could feel a strange sense of finality in the air. It was like they were done with whatever they had come to do. They backed, away from me, and I suddenly felt a weight lifted from my chest. But the relief didn't last long. The next thing I knew, I was being pulled again. This time, I didn't have control over my body. I was no longer floating. This time I was being dragged or moved without my will through a narrow corridor. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The walls around me seemed to pulse with a strange light, like they were alive. I could hear a low hum, almost like machinery working, but it wasn't anything I could recognize. There was no sound of doors opening, no creaking, just that soft hum. I could feel the air getting colder as I was led down the hall. It didn't make sense. Nothing here made sense. The fear that I had pushed away earlier began to settle in again, creeping up my spine. It wasn't the fear of the beings anymore, but the fear of being completely lost, of never getting back home. And that thought, that realization, was worse than anything I had felt up until then. What were they doing to me? What did they want? Why was I the one chosen for this? Then, something happened that I can still feel in my bones to this day. As I moved through that hallway, a door opened ahead of me. A soft, almost imperceptible light spilled out, casting strange shadows against the walls. My feet moved on their own, and I found myself walking into the light. It was warm, comforting, and I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. But the moment I stepped into that room, I felt everything shift again. There were no windows, no way to tell if it was day or night outside, but this room, it felt wrong. Everything was too perfect, too clean. There was a table in the center, cold metal, and I was led to it. The beings didn't speak. They didn't need to. I knew what they wanted. As I was placed on the table, I tried to move my limbs, but they were numb, like I couldn't control them anymore. A cold metallic object was placed over my chest, and it felt invasive. Not in a painful way, but in a way that made my entire body feel foreign. There were no words exchanged. It was like they didn't need words. I could feel their focus, their attention, like a weight pressing down on me. And then, they began something else. I can't fully describe it, but it was as if they were pulling something out of me, something I didn't know was there. It wasn't physical. at least not in the way we understand. It was as if they were accessing a part of my mind, my soul, that I didn't know existed. I don't know how long it went on. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. But I remember the feeling of being completely exposed, vulnerable, and I felt like I was losing pieces of myself in that moment. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The beings withdrew, and I was left there on that cold metal table, feeling like I had been drained. But something was different. I could feel a strange sense of calm, an emptiness. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was a sort of quiet that enveloped me, as if the chaos of everything I had just experienced had left me hollow. The beings moved away from me, and once again, the hum of the room seemed to fade. I felt like I was finally allowed to move. My body, which had felt like it was trapped in one place, became mine again. I could move my fingers, my legs. I was free, but the fear didn't go away. It followed me. As I tried to sit up, the room around me shifted, the walls bending in ways that didn't make sense. I could still feel the presence of the beings, but they were no longer near me. I didn't know where they went, but I knew one thing: they hadn't finished with me. They were done for the moment, but they would be back. I could feel it. I tried to stand, but before I could, the room faded away and I was back where I had started. My house, my kitchen, my children, everything was as it was. But it didn't feel the same. Something inside me was broken, like the fabric of my reality had been torn apart, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew I had experienced something that no one would ever believe. But I had to tell someone. I had to make sense of it, even if I never could. I don't know how long it took for me to regain my sense of reality. It felt like I was standing outside myself, like I wasn't fully there, like I was still floating in the dark space they'd pulled me from. My children were playing in the living room just like before. It should have been a comfort, seeing them safe, hearing their laughter. But all I felt was this overwhelming dread. I knew that what had just happened wasn't some dream, some fantasy. It had been real, and it had changed something inside me that I couldn't explain. It was like my mind had been cracked open, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't glue the pieces back together. I tried to focus on the things that were supposed to matter: my kids, my home, my life. But it all felt so distant. The memory of the beings, of the table, of the cold, sterile room, stayed with me, like an echo in the back of my mind. I kept replaying everything they did to me, but there was no understanding. I couldn't make sense of it. The more I thought about it, the less I felt like myself. I felt like I'd been touched by something that was far beyond my comprehension. And no matter how hard I tried to block it out, it always found its way back. A few days later, I began to have flashes of memories. Things I hadn't remembered in the moment, but now were coming back to me with terrifying clarity. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something bigger than myself, something far beyond what I could understand. It wasn't just the abduction, it was everything that came with it. The feelings, the sensations, the fear. The images in my mind kept coming in waves, relentless, like they were pushing their way to the surface, trying to break through. I couldn't ignore them. I tried to go on with my life, tried to pretend nothing had changed, but I could feel the pressure inside me building. One night, in desperation, I reached out for help. I spoke to a psychologist, someone I trusted, and told them about what had happened. It wasn't easy, and I had to fight through the embarrassment and fear of being called crazy. But when I told them about the beings, about the cold room, about the light, I saw the look in their eyes. They didn't laugh. They didn't dismiss me. They listened. And that's when I was introduced to the idea of hypnosis. Hypnosis might seem odd, but I needed to remember. I needed to understand what had happened to me. So I agreed to undergo sessions of regressive hypnosis, hoping it would bring me some answers. The first session was strange. At first I felt nothing. The psychologist told me to relax, to let go, and I did. But as I sank deeper into the trance, something inside me shifted. It was like all the walls I had built up inside my mind were torn down, and everything I had experienced, the coldness, the fear, the light, came rushing back. I could feel the beings again, standing around me, their presence so real it was almost like they were in the room with me. The more I relaxed, the more vivid the memories became. I saw the craft, the metallic walls, the beings surrounding me, their hands so cold against my skin. The probing wasn't physical, it was more like a mental intrusion. It felt like they were digging into my thoughts, pulling things out of me that I didn't even know existed. And then I remembered the room, the place that was so sterile, so cold and impersonal. I saw flashes of other abductions, times when they had come back, for me. Each time I felt different, like I was being shaped, molded into something that wasn't quite human anymore. I could hear the voice in my head, the one that wasn't mine, telling me that this was necessary. I don't know how long I was under during that first session, but when I came to, I was shaking. It felt like I had just relived it all over again, and the reality of what had happened hit me harder than before. I was left with more questions than answers, and the terror had only deepened. After that first hypnosis session, the memories didn't stop. They kept coming back, relentless, and I began to question if they were ever really gone in the first place. My sleep, which had once been peaceful, was now filled with nightmares. The beings, those strange cold creatures, were always there. I could see their faces, their large eyes, and I could feel them watching me. Even when I was awake, it felt like they were still lurking in the corners of my mind, just out of reach, waiting. The fear that once seemed so distant was now a constant companion. I found myself looking up at the sky every night, wondering if they would return. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was an overwhelming sense of anticipation, as if they were out there, waiting to come back. And part of me felt like I was waiting too, like I had already been chosen for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had been altered in ways I didn't understand, and maybe it was out of my control now. Every time I tried to move on, to ignore it, the memories would rise up, and I couldn't escape them. I even started to feel that there was something different about me. Like I wasn't entirely human anymore, like a part of me had been replaced by something else. And that thought terrified me more than anything. The thought that I wasn't the person I had been before. I kept seeing the same faces in my dreams, and as the weeks went by, I realized these weren't just memories. These were more like warnings that I couldn't fully comprehend. It was like they were trying to tell me something, but the words never came, just images, flashes of their presence. They weren't hostile, but there was something coldly indifferent about them. They didn't care about me in the way humans care about each other. They were so far removed from human emotion that it made them even more terrifying. I thought about the way they had touched me, their hands against my skin, and the strange, invasive feeling that had followed. It wasn't just an abduction anymore. It was like a process, something that they did to people like me. I started reading everything I could about abductions, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening to me. The more I read, the more I realized that I wasn't alone. There were others like me, people who had experienced the same thing, who had felt the same sense of confusion and loss. But none of us had answers. The more I learned, the less I understood. I couldn't even tell anyone what had really happened to me because I didn't know if I truly understood it myself. How could I explain something that felt so unreal? Then, one night, after I had been awake for hours, the feeling hit me again. The overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I got up from my bed, feeling that pull, that connection to something I couldn't explain. I went to the window and looked out at the dark sky. The stars were barely visible through the haze of city lights, but I knew they were out there. And just as I stood there, staring up into the night, something shifted. There was a flicker in the sky. At first, I thought it was a plane, but the movement was too fast, too erratic. It darted across the sky, as if it knew I was watching, as if it was waiting for me to notice. I couldn't look away. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. It moved again, this time in a way that defied logic. I felt a chill run through me. It was them. They were out there. And this time, it wasn't just a memory or a dream. It was real. It was happening again. I knew it in the pit of my stomach, that gut-wrenching certainty. But before I could make sense of it, the object darted away, vanishing into the night as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I had just seen. My mind raced, but there were no answers. The terror had returned, sharper this time, and I felt the weight of it sinking into me. I couldn't escape this. I couldn't escape them. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I tried to, my mind would drift back to that moment. The object in the sky, the flicker of light. The undeniable truth that I wasn't alone. It was like I was living in two worlds at once. The world I knew, where everything seemed normal, and this other world, the one I couldn't escape, the one where the memories and the terror of the abduction lived. It didn't matter what I did, I couldn't get away from it. My body felt heavy, like it was weighed down by this unseen force. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep at night. I started to avoid looking at the sky. I didn't want to see them again, didn't want to face that truth. But even when I closed my eyes, I saw them, the beings, their cold presence, their long outstretched fingers, their dark eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about them, about the way they had touched me, about the way they had taken me. It was like I was living in their world now, and no matter how much I tried to fight it, there was nothing I could do to break free. I decided to go back to the therapist for another session of hypnosis. I needed to understand. I had to know what they had done to me, what they wanted. There was something inside me, some primal fear, that told me I had to face it, no matter how terrifying it was. I had no control over it anymore. It was like they had taken that from me. When I went under this time, it was different. The memories didn't come in flashes like before. This time it was like I was there again, standing in that cold, sterile room, surrounded by them. Their hands, their eyes. Everything was more vivid. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on me. But there was something else. This time, something that made my blood run cold. As I looked around, I noticed that there were others with me. People like me who had been taken. We were all standing there together, waiting, and I knew deep in my soul that we weren't alone. That feeling, that sense of being part of something larger than myself, was stronger than ever before. And then I heard the voice again. It wasn't spoken aloud. It was inside my head, clear as day, telling me that I was part of something bigger, something that had been planned long before I was born, that I was chosen. I didn't understand what that meant, but I knew it wasn't good. The rest of the hypnosis session was a blur, and when I woke up, I felt empty. It was like a part of me had been torn away, and nothing could fill that space. I didn't know what to do with the knowledge I had just uncovered, and I couldn't share it with anyone. How could I? Who would believe me? But the worst part wasn't the hypnosis or the fact that I'd been chosen for something I didn't understand. It was the feeling that followed me after. The feeling that they were always watching, that no matter where I went, they were there. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the cold presence that lingered in the corners of my mind. It was like they had marked me, and no matter how hard I tried to outrun it, they would always find me. I went through the motions of my life, but it felt like I was just going through the motions. Nothing felt real anymore. It was like I was living in a dream, one I couldn't wake up from. And then it stopped, just like that. No more flashes of light in the sky, no more strange dreams, no more feelings of being watched. It was like they had disappeared as quickly as they had come. I never saw them again, never heard their voice again. I don't know what to make of it. Part of me wants to believe it was all just a dream, that maybe I was just losing my mind. But deep down, I know it wasn't. I know what I felt, what I saw. I know that they were real, and that they took me. I don't know why, and I don't know what they wanted. But it's over now. Or at least I think it is. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel them watching me. I still look up at the sky and wonder if they're out there, waiting. Second story. Allagash case, 1976. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's some kind of desperate attempt to make sense of it all, or maybe it's just to get it out of my head. But I feel like I have to share it. It's been years since it happened, but the memories are still as sharp as ever, like a knife scraping across my brain. Sometimes I can't shake the feeling that I'm still there, in that canoe, on that night, looking up at something I still can't explain. I guess it's easier to just tell myself that it was a bad dream, but I know it wasn't. 4 of us were there, just 4 friends on a canoe trip out on the calm waters of Allagash Lake in Maine, far away from anything that could distract us. The air was warm, the stars were clear, and we were just taking it all in. The kind of evening where everything feels peaceful and you think there's nothing that could ruin it. We were joking, laughing, probably talking about the usual things: life, work, girls, the dumb stuff men talk about when they're not thinking about anything serious. It wasn't anything special, just a normal trip, until it wasn't. At first, it was just a flicker in the sky, something I couldn't even explain. I thought it was a star at first, but it was moving, slowly but deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going. I remember we all noticed it at the same time. Nobody said anything at first, just staring, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. I think we all hoped it was a plane, or maybe a helicopter just passing by. But it wasn't. It wasn't anything like that. The light wasn't like anything we'd seen before. It wasn't blinking like an aircraft. It was steady, and it seemed wrong. Almost too bright, too focused. And then it started moving closer. By the time we realized what was happening, it was already hovering above us. Not a plane, not a helicopter, not even a meteor. This was something else. It was huge, but I couldn't give you an exact size. It was like it filled the entire sky above us, a bright, blinding light that seemed to pulse, like it was alive. My brain couldn't catch up with what my eyes were telling me. I think we all had that same feeling of being paralyzed, not knowing whether to run or to stay still, but too scared to do anything. I still don't know how to explain the feeling. It wasn't just fear. It was a kind of dread that went deep into your bones, like every nerve in your body was screaming that you were about to die, but you couldn't move, couldn't escape. It was like time had stopped, and I remember looking around at my friends. We were all frozen, staring up at the light, and then everything went dark. The next thing I knew, we were back in the canoe, but something was off. The light was gone. The lake was calm again, but it felt wrong. It felt like we'd missed hours, like we'd somehow lost time. We couldn't remember what happened in those lost hours, but we all felt it. A silence settled over us and nobody spoke. It was like we all knew something had changed, but we didn't know what. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just confusion, maybe a trick of the mind, but it didn't go away. It stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my head. It wasn't until years later, when we finally went through those hypnotherapy sessions, that the pieces started to fall into place. We never talked about it after that night. None of us did. I don't know why. Maybe it was the fear of sounding crazy. Maybe it was because we were too scared to face the truth. But after a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what had happened, and I guess so did the others. We all went to a therapist who specialized in hypnosis, hoping to understand the black hole in our memories. It wasn't until we were under that we learned what happened during that missing time. We all had the same memories, even though none of us had shared anything with each other. We saw the same things: strange figures, cold metal, and an overwhelming sense of being. Not alone. I'm not sure how to explain it, but they were there. I don't know what they were, but they weren't human. The procedures they did to us, I don't even want to think about them. I don't know if they were experiments or something else, but I can tell you one thing: whatever it wasn't by accident. They knew what they were doing, and I've never been the same since. After those sessions, everything felt different. It was like the floodgates had opened, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, even though I wished I could. I tried to go back to living my life like I did before, but nothing felt the same. It was like I could never escape that night, no matter how hard I tried. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the light, and I could feel them, those creatures. I know it sounds insane, but I still remember the way they moved. It wasn't natural. Their movements were almost mechanical, like they weren't even trying to mimic human motion. And their eyes, I still can't get the image of those eyes out of my head. Big, dark, and so empty, like they were looking right through me. They didn't need to say anything. I could feel what they wanted. It was like they had this telepathic pull, and I just knew what was going to happen next before it even happened. I still don't understand how that works, but I know it was real. What's worse is that the other guys, the ones who were there with me, they've all said the same thing. We haven't talked much, but when we do, it's like there's this unspoken understanding between us. We all know that whatever we saw, whatever they did to us, it wasn't just some dream or some trick of the mind. There's no way it was. I tried to tell myself that maybe it was some kind of shared hallucination, or maybe it was the stress of being out there in the middle of nowhere. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the memories. And the thing that really messes with me is that it's still happening, even now. Little things, like strange lights in the sky, or waking up in the middle of the night with a feeling that something isn't right. It's like they're still out there watching. I know that sounds crazy, but it's the truth. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, and I don't know why. I'll sit up, staring into the dark, and it feels like they're there, watching me, waiting. I can't explain it, but I swear something's wrong. And sometimes, when I look up at the stars, I wonder if they're out there too, waiting for the right time to come back. There are days when I wish I could just forget about the whole thing. I really do. But then something happens that brings it all back. Like the other night, when I was driving down a quiet road just outside of town, and I saw a light in the distance. At first, I thought it was a plane or maybe some kind of tower light. But then it started moving in a way that made no sense. I felt my heart sink and my palms went sweaty. It was like that same feeling from the lake, the same sick feeling in my stomach, like I was being pulled towards it. I tried to shake it off, tried to keep driving, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away. The light didn't blink or flash like it should have. It was just there, steady, and it moved in this smooth, unnatural way, as if it was following me. I drove faster, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. I don't know what happened after that, but I don't remember the rest of the drive. I came to my senses when I pulled into my driveway, but I wasn't sure how I got there. The worst part is that I don't think it was the last time. I think they know where I am, and I think they're still out there, watching, always watching. What really messes with me is that the feeling never goes away. I can't pinpoint when it started, but I've started to get this sensation in the back of my mind. This quiet, persistent hum. It's like an itch I can't scratch, a presence I can't shake. And it's been years since that night on Allagash Lake. But there are days, more and more frequently now, where I can't escape it. It's not just the occasional weird lights or waking up with a strange sense of unease. There's something deeper, something I can't explain, that seems to follow me wherever I go. Sometimes I'll be sitting at home watching TV or out with friends, and suddenly I feel this strange pull. A kind of pressure in the air, almost like the world is holding its breath. I'll glance out the window, and for just a second, I'll see something. Not a clear shape, but a flicker in the sky. A sudden flash of light. Or sometimes just an empty patch of sky that doesn't sit right. It's hard to describe. It's not the same as seeing an airplane or a star. It's something else entirely. Something that shouldn't be there, but is. It's like the space around me isn't quite real, like there's a hole in reality that they can slip through. I've never said this out loud to anyone. Maybe I'm afraid of what they'd think, but sometimes I can hear a voice in my head. Not words, not sounds exactly, but a kind of pressure on my thoughts. Like something is trying to communicate, but it's not using language the way we do. It's more like they're showing me things in flashes, little glimpses of what they want me to see. And it's always the same images, metal, sharp lights, and faces that I can't look at for too long, because when I do, I feel like my mind will snap in half. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I told myself it was just stress, or maybe just my mind playing tricks on me. but the more I tried to push it down, the worse it got. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the feeling in my chest so tight I couldn't breathe. The walls of my room would feel like they were closing in on me, and I'd hear noises, soft, mechanical hums, almost like a distant engine running. I'd rush to the window, looking out into the night, half expecting to see something hovering in the sky, but it was always gone when I checked. And then one night, it happened again. I was at a cabin upstate with my wife, trying to get away from everything, trying to get some peace. I remember I couldn't sleep. There was this strange quiet in the woods, something off in the air that I couldn't shake. I kept hearing footsteps outside, like someone was walking around the cabin. But when I'd look, there was nothing there. It was just me and my wife alone. But I couldn't stop myself from checking. I couldn't ignore that feeling. So I grabbed a flashlight and went out into the woods. I didn't even think about it, just instinctively, like I had to, and that's when I saw it. The light, just like before. It was the same steady glow, but this time it was closer. And it wasn't just one light. There were three, moving slowly through the trees, almost like they were circling me. I froze. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. They were there again, watching, waiting. And that's when it hit me. They were always watching, always there, and I couldn't run from it anymore. I don't remember much after that. I don't know if I passed out or if I just shut down mentally, but when I came to, I was back in the cabin, lying in bed, drenched in sweat. My wife was still asleep beside me, but something was off. I felt different. I looked around, expecting to see something in the shadows, expecting to hear that humming noise again. But there was nothing. Just silence. It was as if nothing had happened, like I had imagined it all, but I knew I hadn't. I knew what I'd seen, and even though it was quiet, I could still feel it. The weight of their presence, the pressure in the air. I didn't tell my wife about it, and I didn't tell anyone else either. What was there to say? I don't think anyone would believe me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there somewhere, just waiting for the right time, the right moment to come back. The truth is, I don't think I'll ever be rid of it. I don't think I'll ever get away from them, no matter how hard I try. They've marked me, just like they marked the others, and I don't think they'll ever let go. I don't know what they want or why they chose us, but it doesn't matter, because every time I look up at the sky, I know they're still out there, watching, waiting, and I don't think they're done with me yet. There are moments even now when the whole experience hits me like a punch to the gut. It doesn't matter how much I try to push it aside or pretend like it's just a bad memory. The truth is, the scars they left on me run deep. It's not just the flashes of light or the voices in my head. It's the overwhelming sense of dread that comes with it. I know I'm not the only one who feels this way. Every now and then, when I run into the other guys from the Allagash trip, I can see it in their eyes. They don't need to say a word for me to know that they're still haunted too. I remember one night, just a few months ago, I ran into Jim at a bar. We hadn't talked much since that night, but we've stayed in touch. He looked different, older, tired. The years had aged him, but it was something else in his eyes that made me uneasy. He looked at me like he was waiting for me to say something, and when I asked him how he'd been, he just stared at me for a long time, like he was processing something, and then said, "I can still hear them sometimes." I didn't even have to ask who he meant. I didn't have to say anything, because in that moment, I realized that we were all carrying the same burden. None of us could escape it. I didn't even want to talk about it out loud, but we both knew there was no point in pretending. The lights, the hums, the strange dreams. Jim was living with the same quiet horror I was. And even though we didn't say much more after that, it felt like an unspoken bond was formed. Not the kind of bond that makes you feel safe, but one that ties you together in some twisted, painful way. Like we were all cursed, all doomed to feel the presence of something we couldn't understand, something we couldn't outrun. After that, I started researching more about abductions. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe a scientific explanation, a way to rationalize what happened. But the more I read, the more I became convinced that whatever we saw that night wasn't just a figment of our imagination. And what bothered me even more was the fact that so many other people had similar experiences. I don't know why I didn't want to face it at first. Maybe I was scared to admit that it wasn't just me, scared that it meant I wasn't going. Insane that this was actually happening to others too. But once I started digging deeper, the dots started to connect. There were countless reports of people experiencing the same kind of missing time. Strange lights in the sky, and memories that seemed to resurface after years, just like ours. There's this one thing I've learned through all of this. The more I find out, the less I understand. I read about a woman in Arizona who described seeing beings similar to what we saw. Tall, thin, with large black eyes that seemed to look right through her. She described being on a table, her body frozen, just like the others. The crazy thing is that the details she gave about the procedure, the way they touched her, how her body felt heavy and numb, sounded exactly like what I remembered from that night. I started thinking about how all of this wasn't just an isolated event, how this phenomenon is happening everywhere, all the time, and we're just part of a much larger picture that we can't even begin to comprehend. The more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe they've always been here. Maybe we're just part of their experiment, or maybe we're just a blip in their timeline. I don't know. I don't even know if I'll ever understand. But something inside of me refuses to believe that it was a coincidence. We didn't just see something that night. We experienced something that changed us. And when I look at the world around me now, I see things differently. It's like there's a layer to everything that I didn't notice before. A kind of hidden reality that's always been there, but it's only now that I can see it. It's in the way people act, the things they say, the way they look at me when I talk about what happened. I don't talk about it much anymore, I don't need to. But I can feel it, the way people look at me with doubt or with curiosity. They want to know more, but they don't want to know everything. They want to ask questions, but they don't want to hear the answers. It's like we've all been conditioned to ignore it, to push it away, to pretend it's not there. But I can't do that anymore. I can't pretend. Every time I see a strange light in the sky or hear a hum in the distance, I know that they're still out there waiting. I don't think I'll ever have peace again. I don't think any of us will. The more I try to move on, the more I realize that they've left a mark on me, on all of us. It's not just a memory. It's a part of me now, a shadow that I can't escape. I don't know if I'll ever be able to live a normal life again, and the worst part, I don't know if I even want to. I don't know if I'll ever get answers. Maybe I don't even want them anymore. There was a time when I was obsessed with figuring it all out. Why us? Why that night? Why any of this at all? I wanted so badly to believe there was some kind of explanation that would make it all make sense, something logical, something human. But the more I searched, the more I realized that whatever happened to us that night Whatever continues to happen, it isn't meant to be understood. It doesn't fit into the way we think about the world. People always ask, why don't they just show themselves? Why don't they just land on the White House lawn? And I think I know the answer now. Because they don't have to. They don't need to make an announcement or explain themselves. They don't care if we believe in them or not. They move in the spaces between what we know, in the cracks of our reality. They take who they want, when they want, and they leave just enough behind for us to remember, just enough to make us question everything. And that's the worst part, knowing that I'll never really know. I'll never be able to put it in a neat little box and say, this is what happened and this is why. There's no closure, no real answers. Just the lingering, suffocating feeling that it could happen again. That maybe it already has, and I just don't remember. I've stopped telling people about it. I learned the hard way that most of them don't want to hear it. They nod, they listen, but I can see it in their eyes, that flicker of doubt, that forced politeness, like they're trying to find a way to change the subject without making me feel crazy. Some of them think I'm lying. Others think I just had some kind of breakdown, that maybe I was sleep-deprived, hallucinating. I've heard all the explanations: swamp gas, sleep paralysis, a psychological coping mechanism, and you know what? I'd love for one of them to be right. I'd love for someone to look me in the eye and prove to me beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was all in my head. But they can't. Because it wasn't. Because I wasn't alone that night. And even if I never told another soul what happened, even if I took it to my grave, I know the truth. And the truth is, they are out there, they are watching, and they are not done with us. Fiend, I don't expect anyone to believe me. That's not why I'm writing this. I guess I just wanted to get it out, to put it somewhere outside of my own mind for once. Maybe someone out there has gone through the same thing. Maybe they're reading this now, feeling the same weight pressing down on their chest, knowing deep down that they're not alone. If that's you, if you've seen the lights, if you've woken up in places you don't remember going to, if you've ever felt that presence in the room when no one else was there, you're not crazy, and you're not alone. I don't know what they want or why they chose us, but I know one thing for sure. Once you see them, once they take you, they never really let you go. You can try to forget. You can pretend it never happened. You can go years without thinking about it. But one day, when you least expect it, you'll look up at the sky and you'll see something, a light that isn't supposed to be there. A shadow in the corner of your vision that vanishes when you turn your head. A feeling deep in your bones that you've been here before, that you've felt this before. And in that moment, you'll know. They never left. And they never will. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, the Linda Courtile case, 1989. It's hard to explain what happened that day. Looking back, I can't say exactly when everything started to go wrong, but I can tell you this. It was an ordinary afternoon in 1989. I was at home, in my New York apartment, just minding my own business. The sun was out, and it was one of those days where everything feels peaceful, almost too peaceful. I was by the window, just looking out, maybe thinking about what I'd do for the rest of the day. But then, everything changed in an instant. Out of nowhere, there was this intense, blinding light. so bright it almost felt like the sun had suddenly exploded right in front of me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. It was like my body wasn't responding. I could feel a strange force pulling me upward, like gravity just stopped existing. And before I could even comprehend what was happening, I was being dragged out of the apartment window. The strangest part, I couldn't scream, couldn't move a single muscle. I was just being lifted into the air. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or if this was really happening. It felt like a nightmare, but it wasn't. I knew it was real, and that terrified me. As I was being pulled higher and higher, I looked up, and that's when I saw it. I couldn't believe my eyes. A massive metallic craft, something I'd never seen before, was hovering above me. It wasn't like any plane, helicopter, or anything I had ever heard of. It was enormous, glowing in a way that almost hurt to look at. The shape was strange, almost impossible to describe. My mind couldn't wrap around what I was seeing. I kept telling myself, this isn't real, this can't be happening. But it was. The light around me got brighter, and I could feel a pull, a force that seemed to come from the ship itself, and it was dragging me in. I tried to move, to fight, to scream, but I couldn't. It was like I was frozen in place. There was no escaping it. No matter how hard I tried to resist, my body just wasn't responding. I remember thinking, this is it. I'm being taken somewhere. But where? And why? Then, just as suddenly as it all began, I was yanked up, into the air, and I was inside the ship. The interior of the ship was unlike anything I've ever seen. It didn't look like any kind of spaceship you see in movies, nothing like the science fiction stuff. It was sterile, cold, and everything around me was just so bright. I couldn't focus on any one thing because the light was blinding, almost like it was coming from everywhere. I couldn't move. No matter how much I tried, I was completely still, like I was being held in place by some invisible force. The weirdest part was the silence. It was like the whole world had shut off. No hum of machines, no sound of my own breathing, just complete unnerving silence. It was suffocating. And then I felt it, this sharp, intense pain in my head. It felt like someone was poking around inside my skull, like they were searching for something. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew something wasn't right. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like hours, like I was trapped in that cold, silent space forever. I don't know how to explain what happened next. There were figures, tall, humanoid. At least they seemed humanoid. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were black, so black that it was like looking into the void itself. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could feel them watching me. The thing is, I couldn't move. I couldn't react. It was like my body had been stripped of all control, and whatever these beings were, they were in charge. I could hear faint whispers in my mind, but I couldn't make out the words. It wasn't like they were speaking aloud, but rather, it was like their thoughts were being transferred directly into my head. I remember a feeling of cold dread, but at the same time a strange sense of helplessness, like I was no longer in control of my own fate. I tried to fight, tried to scream, but nothing happened. I was just paralyzed. Then they started doing things to me. I don't even know how to describe it, because my mind still doesn't want to believe it. They didn't hurt me in the way I thought they would. No sharp instruments or violence. It was more like they were studying me. They were prodding and poking at my body, taking samples, and it felt like my skin was being pulled apart in places. But there was no blood, no pain. It was more like a cold, numb sensation, almost like I was being dissected without actually being touched. The worst part was how I couldn't stop it. I wasn't able to move, to scream, to even cry. All I could do was lie there, helpless, as these beings did whatever it was they were doing to me. And then, I don't know how, but I started hearing voices, real voices, voices from outside the ship. People were shouting, calling my name. I wasn't alone. There were witnesses. I had no idea how they could see me, but I could hear them clearly. They sounded just as confused, just as scared as I was. And that's when I realized I wasn't imagining any of this. It was real. All of it. That's when the panic set in. I don't know how much time had passed at that point, but I could feel the air inside the ship growing thicker, heavier. It was almost suffocating. And then I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A low hum, like a machine powering up. I could feel the vibrations deep in my chest. I knew something was about to happen, and whatever it wasn't good. The beings around me began to move faster, as if they were preparing to do something. My heart was racing, my breath shallow and erratic, and I could feel the terror creeping in. I wanted to beg them to stop, but I couldn't. And that's when everything went black. Not like I passed out, but like the world just turned off. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't feel anything. It was as if I had ceased to exist for a moment, and when I came back to myself, I was lying on the floor of my apartment again. Just like that, everything was over. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed. Something I couldn't explain. I had no idea how I'd gotten back or what had really happened to me. All I knew was that I was terrified, and I would never be the same again. I didn't know what to do. I was back in my apartment, sitting on the floor, feeling completely disoriented. The room looked the same. Nothing seemed out of place. But I knew something was deeply wrong. I had no recollection of how I got back. No memory of what happened after I blacked out. My body felt strange, like I had been through some kind of intense ordeal. But at the same time, I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had occurred. I looked around the apartment, trying to find any evidence of what had just happened. Any sign that I had been taken, any sign that something had invaded my space. But there was nothing. Everything was still. The quiet was deafening. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. As I stumbled to the window, I glanced outside, hoping to make sense of the world around me. But that's when I noticed something strange. There were people outside staring up at the sky. There was no mistaking it. They were watching the same thing I had seen. I could see their faces, their expressions of disbelief, and their eyes fixed on something in the sky. It wasn't just me. They had seen what happened to me. They had witnessed it too. And the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There were witnesses. The same people who had been shouting my name earlier were right there, confirming everything I had experienced. They weren't just people on the street. They were the ones who had seen me being pulled out of my apartment, who had watched as I was taken into the sky. It wasn't just a dream or a hallucination or some sort of mental break. It was real, and I wasn't the only one who knew it. The fear that gripped me at that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt. I wasn't alone in this. The truth was out there, and I had no idea what to do with it. I don't even know how to explain what came after that. My mind couldn't process it. I spent days trying to make sense of everything, replaying the events over and over in my head, trying to figure out what had really happened. But the more I thought about it, the more the memories seemed to twist and warp. I could remember the coldness of the ship, the unnatural silence, the feeling of being watched by those dark eyes, but there were also gaps, moments that I couldn't fill in. I felt like my mind had been tampered with, like parts of what happened to me had been erased, maybe intentionally. I tried reaching out to the people who had been on the street that day, those who had witnessed my abduction, but when I found them, it was like they didn't want to talk about it. They were scared too. Some of them said they didn't remember what they saw. Others claimed they'd mistaken it for something else. An airplane, a weather balloon, anything but the truth. I could feel the unease in their voices, the fear in their eyes. It was like they were all pretending it hadn't happened, trying to bury it. And as for me, I couldn't let it go. I couldn't pretend I hadn't been taken. I couldn't forget what I saw and felt. The truth was too heavy, but no one seemed to want to hear it. I was starting to realize that the more I tried to talk about it, the more people would avoid me or make me feel like I was losing my mind. But I knew what happened to me. I knew it in my bones. I had been taken, and there was no going back. The more time passed, the more I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. Every little noise made my heart race, and every shadow in my apartment made me jump. I couldn't escape the feeling that they were still watching me, still waiting for me to remember more of what happened. My mind kept circling back to those eyes, those dark, endless eyes that stared at me. There was something about them that still haunted me, something I couldn't shake off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them even in my dreams. It was as if those beings were still with me, lingering in the background of my thoughts. I couldn't trust my own memories anymore. They were fragmenting, shifting, becoming distorted. I started to question everything around me. Were the people on the street really witnesses? Or was I imagining them? Was the ship real, or was it some kind of elaborate hallucination? But no matter how hard I tried to deny it, I couldn't escape the truth. I knew what I had experienced, even if no one else would believe me. The worst part wasn't the abduction itself. It was the fear that I wasn't alone, that there were others out there in the world who had experienced the same thing, and they were just as scared as I was. And I couldn't help but wonder, why had they taken me? Why had I been chosen? I don't have answers. All I know is that what happened to me was real, and it changed me in ways I can't explain. And I don't think I'll ever fully understand it. But I'll never forget. Never. Over the following months, I tried to return to a normal life, but nothing felt the same. I couldn't escape the feeling that something had been altered in me, something beyond my comprehension. It wasn't just the memories of that day, the ship, the figures, the cold silence, but the sensation that I was no longer living in the same reality. There were days where I felt like I was floating, detached from everything around me, as if I was a spectator in my own life. People who had once been close to me started to notice my behavior, how distant I had become, how easily I was startled by the smallest things. They didn't understand, couldn't understand. I tried to explain what happened, but the moment I started talking about it, their expressions would shift, and I could see the discomfort in their eyes. It was like they wanted to believe me, but at the same time, they couldn't fathom it. And I don't blame them. If I hadn't lived through it, I wouldn't have believed it either. But the worst part was the isolation. It wasn't just the loneliness of not being able to talk to anyone about it. It was the quiet terror that settled in the pit of my stomach every time I found myself alone. I would look out my windows, check the sky, feel the air grow thick with tension. I felt like they were out there, watching me still, waiting for the right moment to come back. My every move, my every glance toward the sky felt like an invitation. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a deep, instinctive knowledge that whatever had happened to me wasn't finished. It was still out there, still looking for me. One night something happened that made all of this even worse. It was a Thursday around 2 a.m. I had been tossing and turning in bed, the same anxiety keeping me awake. The feeling of being watched had become a constant presence in my life, so much so that I could almost feel it physically, a weight on my chest. I remember sitting up in bed, my heart racing when I heard it, a low hum, distant but unmistakable. It started faintly, almost like an electric current buzzing in the air. But then it grew louder. My first instinct was to check the windows, and when I did, I saw it. Just for a second, a flicker of light high in the sky. It wasn't a plane or a helicopter or anything I recognized. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. I watched it for a long time, unable to move, unable to look away. The light shifted, changing in shape, almost as if it was watching me too. It hovered there for what felt like an eternity, not moving, just hanging in the air, casting an eerie glow over the city below. I didn't know whether to scream or run. I didn't know what to do, and then just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. One moment, it was there, and the next, it was gone. I didn't hear a sound, didn't feel a thing. It was like it had never been there at all. But the terror that followed, it didn't leave. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the sky, waiting for it to come back, but I knew deep down that it wasn't just the ship or the beings that were haunting me. It was the fear that whatever this was, whatever had taken me, was far from finished. The thought of being taken again, of being dragged into that same cold, silent place made my stomach turn. And I knew, somehow, that it wasn't the last time I'd see that light. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. But the unease never left. I became obsessed with trying to find answers. I started looking into the sightings of strange lights in the sky around New York, trying to piece together any information that could explain what had happened to me. What I found was both comforting and terrifying. There were dozens of reports from people who had seen strange things in the sky, flashes of light, hovering objects, things that couldn't be explained by conventional means. Some of them were from areas close to my apartment, and others came from all over the city. I couldn't ignore the patterns. It seemed like there was something bigger at play, something I wasn't understanding. But the more I dug, the more I realized that no one had any answers. It was like the government, the media, and even the experts were trying to cover it all up. The more I searched for the truth, the more it became clear that no one wanted to talk about it. They wanted to keep it quiet, to pretend it wasn't happening. I even contacted ufologists, people who specialized in this kind of thing, but they were just as puzzled as I was. Some of them were eager to listen, to investigate, but none of them had any concrete answers. And as time went on, I began to wonder if anyone would ever truly know the truth. Maybe there were more people like me, people who had been taken, people who had seen the same things, but who were too scared to speak up. Or maybe it was just me losing my mind. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of something bigger than myself, something I would never fully understand. It wasn't just the unexplainable events that haunted me. It was the slow unraveling of my own sense of self. Every day felt like a battle between what I knew to be real and the growing paranoia that something or someone was playing with my mind. I began to wonder if I was being manipulated in ways I couldn't comprehend, not just physically, but mentally too. The memories of my abduction, if that's what it even was, felt like they were slipping through my fingers, becoming more and more elusive. But there were flashes, tiny fragments of recollections that haunted me. I'd be sitting in a cafe or waiting in line at the store, and I would get this overwhelming sense of déjà vu, like I had been in that exact same place before, at that exact same time. It wasn't just the feeling of having lived through the moment. It was as though I was repeating it. I'd catch myself looking at people, and then my mind would race to something I couldn't fully grasp. Was this a symptom of stress, or was it something more? I started to question my own reality every minute of every day. What if they had done something to me, something that was warping my perception of time? I would catch myself staring at the sky, almost waiting for the same lights, the same ship, to come back. The thoughts terrified me. I tried to distract myself, to force myself to think of anything else, but the fear always crept back in. The worst part was that I couldn't talk about it. There was no one left to share it with. The few people I had confided in had backed off, treated me like I was unstable. Even my closest friends started avoiding me. They had no answers, and I had none to offer them. It wasn't just the fear of what happened to me. It was the fear of being completely alone, of being the only one who knew the truth and not having anyone believe me. One evening, something changed. I had just gotten home from work and I was exhausted. I threw my bag onto the couch and went straight for the kitchen to grab something to eat. As I walked back into the living room, I noticed something strange on the coffee table. It was small, almost insignificant at first glance, but it made my heart race the second I saw it. A tiny, metallic object shaped like a small disc, with grooves etched into the surface. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't mine. I hadn't placed it there. The moment I picked it up, a chill ran down my spine. It felt cold, almost unnaturally so, and I swear I could feel something vibrating within it, something subtle but unmistakable. My hands trembled as I examined it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen it before. It was like a piece of a puzzle I didn't even know existed, and yet, deep down, I knew it was tied to everything that had happened to me. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know if it was just a strange coincidence, or if it had something to do with the abduction, but the fear that gripped me in that moment was all-consuming. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my mind racing, my body paralyzed. It was like the object was calling me, pulling me into a place I wasn't ready to go. The more I held it, the more I felt the pull to remember. But I couldn't. My memory was still shattered, and now, with this thing in my hand, it felt like I was on the edge of a revelation that could either make everything clearer or destroy me. The strangest part. The next morning, the object was gone, vanished. Just like the lights, just like everything else. I didn't see it again. and yet the terror lingered. It was as if I was being toyed with, shown a glimpse of something, and then yanked away before I could fully understand it. It left me shaken to my core, as if I were being pushed to the edge of something too dangerous to comprehend. I didn't know if I should keep searching for answers, or if I should just walk away and try to pretend it never happened. But the thing is, there was no way to unsee it, no way to go back to who I was before. Something had changed, and whatever it was, I didn't know if I was ready to face it. I spent the next few days obsessing over that object, replaying every detail in my mind. The moment it had appeared on the table, the way it had felt in my hands, it was all so vivid. But what really began to eat at me was how quickly it had disappeared. There was no logical explanation for it. I searched every inch of my apartment, checked the floors, the drawers, the trash. Nothing. It was as if the object had never existed, but I knew better. I had felt it. I had touched it. It was real. And that thought alone made me feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I didn't tell anyone about it. Who would believe me? I couldn't even understand it myself. My paranoia intensified and I became more withdrawn. I didn't trust anyone, not anymore. But the worst part was the sense that I was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a knowing. I couldn't escape it. I started getting strange phone calls at night, no one on the other end, just static and a faint hum, like the same noise I had heard when the ship had first appeared. And it was getting worse. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if I was really being followed. I would notice cars parked outside my apartment building at odd hours, or people lingering on street corners staring at me. Was I just paranoid? Or was something, or someone, still keeping tabs on me? It felt like I was being suffocated by fear, like the walls were closing in and the whole world was a stage for something I couldn't understand. I stopped going outside at night. I avoided the windows, and I couldn't sleep. The nights were the worst. I would lie awake in bed, feeling like I was on the edge of something, like any second I would be taken again. But nothing happened. Not that night, and the next. But it didn't matter. The feeling was still there. I was waiting for it, and I knew it was only a matter of time before whatever had happened to me, whatever I had seen and felt, came back for me again. I've spent so much time trying to make sense of everything, but there are no answers. Not really. I don't know if it was aliens or something else entirely. I don't know if I was chosen or if I was just another unlucky person caught up in something far bigger than I could ever understand. I don't know if I'll ever get the closure I'm looking for. All I know is that I've changed. The person I was before, the person who was just going about her life, doing what she thought was normal, she's gone. In her place is someone who knows in the deepest part of their being that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than we could ever imagine. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, because I can never go back to who I was. I'm haunted by what I experienced, and every time I think about it, every time I try to recall the details, I feel like I'm being pulled back into that same nightmare. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget. The fear of what I experienced, the fear of what's out there, is something that stays with you. It gets inside you, and no matter how much time passes, it never truly goes away. That's the thing about the truth, about these kinds of experiences. It leaves you broken, and there's no way to fix that. No one can ever fully understand, and the fear that lives inside you is something no one else can see. So, I keep it to myself. I live with it, and I wait. Because whatever I saw, whatever I experienced, I know it's still out there, waiting to come back. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for me. I just don't know when. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.